And I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor John Muehlbauer, to say a few words about John before he takes the stage. So John is a Senior Research Fellow at Nuffield College and Professor of Economics, and Senior Fellow of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford Martin School, Oxford University. And I've known John's work since I entered the field of housing studies 2 or 3 years ago. John is best known for his work on household economics, housing markets, and how the financial system affects the wider economy. Beginning in the late 1980s, he's one of the first economists to focus on the many complex interactions between housing markets, the economy, and drawing out their policy implications, and has produced seminal work in that area. And he's going to continue the debate tonight by foregrounding the role of land and exploring how we might do something about our dysfunctional housing market to put the broader economic system on a more even keel. And on that note, I'll invite John to come to the stage and share his thoughts with us. John Muehlbauer.
Thanks very much, Alex. It's a special pleasure to be in Bristol, reliving happy memories. Back in the late 70s, I often visited Angus Deaton, who was then in the economics department, to work on our book and on the almost ideal demand system. Moreover, our daughter received a great biochemistry education at this fantastic university, and we all love Bristol. It's a great honor to be given the Keynes lecture, especially for a dyed-in-the-wool Keynesian like me, as an undergraduate at Keynes' own college in the 1960s. Lectures by Keynes' collaborators, students and early adherents were a formative part of my education. Richard Kahn was the originator of the Keynesian multiplier. Nicholas Kaldor contributed greatly to the understanding of speculation, of financial stability and business cycles. And none of the three would have been impressed by the neglect in the new Keynesian economics of coordination problems among markets and of the possibilities of disequilibrium and crises. In my view, proper Keynesian microfoundations need to encompass asymmetric information, credit and liquidity constraints, and uncertainty, and not overstate the ability of individuals to maximize. Formative experiences are really important. My personal experience of London's house price boom during 72-73 sensitized me to the problems of speculative credit booms. At that time, loose fiscal and monetary policy in the Barber boom, combined with a credit deregulation experiment by the Bank of England, had induced a speculative frenzy in the London housing market. Buyers were desperate to board the train of rising house prices before it left the station. Real house prices rose by 68% between early 71 and early 73. I had a lucky escape. I was gazumped and out of the market when the first oil price shock hit, and then real house prices fell by 37% over the next 4 years. Quite an experience. In the 80s, I worried increasingly about the UK's developing credit and house price boom. In an 87 article, I questioned the folly of the poll tax with which Mrs. Thatcher planned to replace property taxes. I also became convinced that the economics profession had seriously underestimated the role of housing and credit in the macroeconomy, and indeed in implications for the regions. We didn't understand why house prices tend to overshoot. We didn't understand how housing and labor markets interact in driving regional migration, and whether housing wealth or housing collateral could drive consumer spending. In answering the last of these questions, in 1980, Anthony Murphy and I examined the consequences of the credit and house price boom that had been going on for consumer spending, the balance of payments, and the overvaluation of sterling. And then 2 years later, the UK was forced to devalue. Much of my research agenda in the next decades was set at that time. A few examples are on the slide. As well as to Anthony, I'm deeply grateful to the late Gavin Cameron in helping my initial understanding of how land, housing, and the economy interact. I'm also greatly indebted to Janine Aron, Keiko Murata, John Duca, and Valerie Chauvin, very important co-authors in later years, and especially to Janine. In the 80s and 90s, empirical work, which embraced market imperfections, information asymmetries, and less than fully rational expectations, that kind of work was unpopular in mainstream economics. In fact, in 1997, the incoming editor of the Economic Journal told me that under his editorship, the paper that had just been published on booms and busts in the UK housing market would not have been published. Housing and credit market interactions with the macroeconomy are many and complex. Particularly in the UK, they're an important channel for the transmission of monetary policy. The UK housing crisis of 90 to 94 that followed the Thatcher boom provided a foretaste of the preeminence of housing in the global financial crisis, and since then, macroprudential policy, as opposed to monetary policy, especially for mortgage markets, has become prominent. Furthermore, housing and the environment are deeply interconnected, since housing is one of the main and most intractable sources of global heating. Economic inequality, especially between generations, and social exclusion are dramatically influenced by housing. Moreover, productivity growth can be severely impeded by failing policies and institutions related to land use, housing, and credit markets. Finally, concerning politics, failing growth and the housing affordability crisis help to explain the rise of the populist right. So it's really important that policy is developed that solves some of these problems. In this regard, the OECD, in producing their outstanding brick-by-brick volumes, which I highly recommend, has recognized the need for joined-up, holistic, cross-departmental policy, given these deep connections between housing and the economy. The Treasury and departments dealing with transport, pensions, the health service, social care, the environment, education, local government, as well as housing, are all intimately affected. And the Bank of England's task would be made much easier if the housing market were less dysfunctional. So, holistic approaches are really important. Let me outline the plan for the lecture. Right. Let me start with the emphasis on land, then I'll turn to the parlous state of the British economy. I'll highlight the key institutions that govern land use, the housing market, and finance and property taxation, and the Thatcher changes. Then I'll turn to the macroeconomic implications for growth, fiscal capacity, and financial stability. Then I'll turn to understanding the supply and demand factors that underlie the UK's housing affordability problem. In line with the OECD's recommendation of a holistic approach, I'll propose a four-part package featuring planning reform, land value capture, expanding social housing, and property tax reform. Then I'll go into some of the issues raised by property tax reform, the benefits, and so on. And then towards the end, I will suggest a politically more realistic proposal, because the ideal policy would take some years to implement, and we need fixes that actually work within the time span of a parliament. By the way, there is a background paper to this talk with much more detail that's available on the Oxford INET website. Right, let me turn to the parlous state of the UK economy. I think many of you will be familiar with some of these facts. Since 1984, the UK has run a continuous balance of payments deficit, meaning the economy produces less than it consumes. that reflects national saving and investment rates that are among the lowest in the OECD. When you run a balance of payments deficit for so long, that means that major parts of UK wealth are transferred to foreign owners. Related to low investment, the productivity record has been dire, particularly in the last 15 years, and made even worse by Brexit, fiscal austerity, and the response to the COVID pandemic. And housing affordability, seen in the high house price to income ratio, is a problem in most of the UK. Surprisingly, while average life expectancy has improved in 20 European countries, of those 20 countries, England has had the slowest rate of improvement. In the OECD, across and within regions, the UK is also one of the most unequal countries. Excluding London, the UK is one of the poorest countries in Northwest Europe. UK poverty and inequality measures are even worse when account is taken of housing costs. And finally, within Northern Europe, we have the worst insulated homes and the highest average commuting times. So, not surprisingly, you can see there is a connection between the current state of Britain and its housing market, one of the most dysfunctional in the world, and not only, as I'll explain, because of the cumbersome planning system. So let's look at some of the history. Intimately connected with the current housing affordability crisis are, of course, the rises in UK house prices and even more in land prices. You can see from the black line that since the early 80s, UK house prices relative to construction costs are far more volatile than in other countries and have risen a great deal more. Now, what does that imply about land? Well, land prices and construction costs drive house prices. A house price index is effectively a weighted average of house prices and a weighted average of the building cost and the land with a constant profit margin. So the first equation says that house prices are a mix of land prices and construction costs. When you divide by CP, the construction cost index, you can see how the two are connected. You can see there's a linear relationship between the house price to construction cost ratio and the land price to construction cost ratio. And S is the share of land in a typical home. If S is a half, you can see that house prices are going to be half as volatile as land prices, and therefore land prices have to be twice as volatile as house prices. So the basic point is that land prices are going to be a lot more volatile than house prices. Now, the impact of this rise in land prices can be seen in the next slide, which shows that the average British house, for the average British house, around 70% of the value of the house is in the value of the land rather than the value of the building. Now, these are national accounts figures put together by national account statisticians, and you can see the UK holds the record, not only the record in these 7 economies, but the record in all countries for which the OECD publish these data. Right, so let me turn to the relevant institutions and the changes that Thatcher made. The institutional framework has many layers. Planning rules, zoning, new town initiatives, and social housing programs shape how quickly land is released, what uses are permitted, influencing both land and house price levels and their geographic incidence. Building and environmental codes set construction quality, while rental standards and contracts are governed by regulation. On the demand side, we have financial regulation, especially for mortgage provision, and of course taxes, stamp duty, mortgage interest tax relief, property and inheritance tax, and together they all influence housing market outcomes. So in 1979, when Mrs. Thatcher was elected, there were 7 key institutional foundations that are worth distinguishing. Back in 1947, the Town and Country Planning Act had created today's discretionary planning system, which incidentally generated large profits on development gains and raised questions about taxing those gains to fund infrastructure. The New Towns program had established large communities managed by long-lived development corporations. Council housing supplied much of the residential stock, with 29% of households in 1979 in social housing. And building standard regulations had evolved throughout the 60s and 70s. Rent controls had long governed the private rental market, although high inflation had eroded the stock. Mortgage supply, dominated by building societies, was tightly steered by credit controls, including the famous bank lending corset, and mortgage interest tax relief for owners had been capped at £25,000. In those days, property taxes, called domestic rates, were linked to 1973 property values. Now, by the end of the 1980s, only the discretionary planning framework survived. All the other institutions were radically reformed. So these were the key reforms. Bank deregulation in 1980 allowed clearing banks to enter the mortgage market, so they got 36% of net advances by 1982, taking over in a big way from the building societies. After regulations were relaxed for building societies, they began taking on risky borrowers, expanding into commercial real estate, estate agency, financial advice, stockbroking, overseas markets, and increasingly relying on wholesale funding, creating what's called maturity mismatch. There was borrowing short to lend long. From around 1985, foreign bank offshoots entered the market, lending through brokers who lacked skin in the game, which weakened credit screening. Not surprisingly, this set the scene for some problems later. Playing a leading role in Mrs. Thatcher's property-owning democracy, the 1980 Housing White Paper introduced the right to buy, granting council tenants very large discounts if they wanted to buy their house. Obviously popular with those tenants, but it slashed the supply of social housing. In 1984, the Building Act undermined quality and safety standards, a legacy that we still see now, evident in the Grenfell Tower tragedy and widespread cladding scandals. Post-war land value capture that was taxing the uplift from plan permission had already been eroded by the 1961 Land Compensation Act. And in 1985, one of the remaining mechanisms for land value capture, the development land tax, was abolished. For the private rental sector, the 88 Housing Act eliminated rent controls on new tenancies and introduced short-term assured tenancies, creating tenant insecurity and nudging occupants towards an occupation. Tax policy also tilted towards owners. From 1984, agricultural property relief and inheritance tax exemption for farms became a tax avoidance tool that raised demand and prices of land. Less importantly, the ceiling on mortgage interest tax relief was raised, although still lagging house prices. But the most politically explosive reform was the replacement of property taxes by the community charge, or the poll tax, announced in 86, implemented in Scotland in 89, and in England in 1990. This was a flat levy that ignored ability to pay. At the time, people said, a dustman pays the same as a lord. Its unpopularity sparked nationwide riots and contributed to Thatcher's 1990 resignation. Yet, in most respects, the Thatcher reforms have persisted many years on, with only small modifications. Perceived NIMBY power stymied planning reform, right to buy policies were retained in England, not in Scotland, by the way. The poll tax was swapped for the council tax in 93, but still very regressive, and now still with a 1991 valuation base. Agricultural land remained a tax haven, lax building regulations remained in place, and lax financial regulation prevailed until the global financial crisis came along and then finally was reformed. There were other small adjustments. Mortgage tax relief became increasingly irrelevant, was eventually phased out, and a new attempt was made to introduce development gain in the 1990 Section 106 agreements, which housing specialists will know all about. So this set of policies, the persistence of these policies, helps to explain our high land cost, which of course hampers economic growth and fuels the chronic housing affordability problem. Let me turn next to the macroeconomic impact of high house prices and volatile house prices, the impact on growth, fiscal capacity, and financial stability. Well, the lax credit conditions, the elimination of domestic rates, and other Thatcher policies spurred the sharp rise that I showed you earlier in house prices relative to construction costs in the late 80s, making the UK an outlier among G7 economies. Easier credit enabled widespread home equity withdrawal, helping to fuel the big consumption boom of the time. And then, tighter monetary policy in 89 as the economy overheated. Tighter monetary policy in 89 triggered a housing crisis and a recession that lasted until 94. Several building societies suffered severe losses and had to be merged. The Bank of England had to rescue the insurers who had provided indemnity insurance to the mortgage lenders. Now, these regulatory failures and incentive distortions of the 80s foreshadowed patterns that we've seen since in the global financial crisis. So it was an interesting sort of prelude to that later crisis. Well, let me turn to the wider long-run consequences. The planning and tax systems impact labour market productivity, resulting in limited worker mobility and increased commuting times. Poor housing quality negatively affects health and human capital, which ultimately lowers worker productivity. And then theory and empirical work in recent years has indicated that high and volatile land prices have quite detrimental macroeconomic effects. Let me review some of this. The basic intuition is very simple. If a single household or firm must spend more on housing or on rent, other worthwhile spending, including investment, will be lower. Seems terribly obvious. Well, this has been developed in terms of the long-run implications in a very interesting model by Hirano and Stiglitz. They show how speculative investment in land hinder growth and investment in productive sectors when credit and land prices boom. So booms like that can be set off by low interest rates and relaxation of lending regulations. The theoretical model is supported by a great deal of cross-country and within-country empirical evidence. Miller and Werner, for example, reveal that boom-bust cycles impede credit flows to more productive sectors. For the US, the 2 US studies show the same kind of thing. For example, increasing bank lending to households during the boom reduced the amount of credit that the firms received in the US. And that damaged investment by firms. In China, similar mechanisms are at work. And in Europe, a very interesting study showed that countries like Ireland, the UK, France, and Spain, where early credit booms occurred, those booms led to total factor productivity losses. Now, turning to the building industry itself, in 2018, I produced a paper that one of the implications of which was to highlight the barriers posed by high land prices on new entrants in the construction industry, suggesting that high and volatile land prices distort priorities towards profits from land appreciation instead of producing quality housing. They also promote the dominance of large building companies. And in the UK, there's been a tremendous increase in concentration in the building industry. Now, all this evidence seems to be quite sharply contradicted by an earlier paper by Black and his co-authors, who argue, in contrast, that high house prices are a good thing. What they do is they show that VAT and private company registrations in the UK vary with fluctuations in home equity, in net home equity. And then they conclude that high house prices are beneficial. They say, our results provide new arguments for favouring taxes on human capital and subsidies on housing assets. But what happened then? As soon as the boom was over, the recession came, they neglect to mention the collapse in new registrations and the record company insolvencies when negative housing equity peaked in the housing downturn in the early 90s. Moreover, encouraging ever higher housing collateral requires ever rising house prices and ever higher land prices. So a short-term sugar rush is not a good way of making long-run policy. And thinking about what's going on, to accumulate collateral for the acquisition of loans, housing collateral for the acquisition of loans, an entrepreneur must invest in housing as opposed to other things like human capital or other kinds of capital, which could have been more beneficial. Those opportunity costs are ignored by the paper. It also focuses on aggregate business formation, which ignores the productivity of the types of businesses that this collateral-based lending goes to. Finally, long-term productivity could benefit a lot more if British banks had more relationship-based business lending models rather than reliance on housing collateral. So I'm very dubious about this piece of work. High land prices affect not only productivity, but also international competitiveness and fiscal capacity. The tax burden linked to housing benefits has grown to about 22 billion in 2022. And since then, restrictive policies have reduced the real value of the benefits, increasing the financial strain on lower income households. And of course, easy credit and high house prices have increased household indebtedness in the UK, which creates a more precarious financial landscape, particularly when interest rates fluctuate in the way that they have in the last few years. Right, let me turn to the UK's affordability problem. And focus on two aspects. One is that international research shows that the response of the UK building industry to demand stimulus is small and slow in comparison with other countries. And the second point is that the drop in council house construction, which you can see here on the graph. So council house construction is the purple line. That drop to almost nothing contributed a great deal to the drop in total construction. Private sector construction has remained pretty even, hasn't compensated for the drop in council house construction. So total supply has been reduced, and of course this lack of supply is part of the reason why prices have gone up. By 2006, about half of the stock of, actually more than half of the stock of council homes had been sold. much of the new build is of poor quality. And this cartoon from a recent New Statesman article provides a kind of illustration. On the that's the cladding scandal. Anyway, limited land release and high land costs often push new builds into noisy, polluted, poorly connected, or high flood risk locations. So it isn't only a quality of the building structure itself, but also the location of the buildings is often not so good. So let me turn to what drives prices, house prices. It's a story of supply and demand, which economists find rather unsurprising. So in the long run, LS is the supply curve. SS is the short run supply curve that says, in the short run the housing stock is pretty fixed, and then when demand shifts from D1 to D2, the price goes from P1 to P2. So the point of this is to explain why you can deduce what drives demand by looking at prices, taking the stock of housing as given. So the key demand shifters are income, population, demography, interest rates, tax policy, and lending standards. And empirical work suggests that the ratio of real household income to the housing stock is the strongest of these drivers. So knowing that, we can, and knowing something about the parameters involved, we can make some deductions about what drives the long-run rise in real house prices. And in this figure, the red line is the rise, shows the rise in real house prices. The blue line shows the contribution of higher household income and population relative to the housing stock. And you can see, actually, at the end there, 63% of the rise in the red line is accounted for by the rise in the blue line. In other words, inadequate building, not keeping up with the growth of income and population, is the main reason why house prices have risen so much. Now, you can also see other things at work. Credit liberalization, credit crunches, interest rate changes, and so on. There's a lot of other things going on, but that's the key one. And by the way, the green line shows the effect of population relative to the housing stock, and it shows that from 1980 to about 2008, actually the housing stock grew faster than population, but of course not enough to keep up with the growth of income. Right, so and just to make a key point here, these findings are very different from those of some influential writing by David Miles and Alice Munro and Ian Mulhern, who, Miles and Munro say it's all real interest rates. It's long-term real interest rate, the decline. That's the key reason why house prices have risen so much. Interest rates are part of the story, but actually the supply and demand story, the lack of supply, is really crucial. And Mulhern is also quite wrong on that. However, it's worth noting that building more is not an instant solution to the affordability problem. It takes time. A 1% boost in the stock would only cut prices by 1.8% if income and population stayed constant, which of course they don't. And the composition matters as well. For example, the steep fall in council house building has hit low-income households especially hard. Despite that, owner occupation among young adults has slipped. So in other words, despite the fact that many few people live in council housing, at the same time, owner occupation among young people has slipped. So here you can see the thick line in the middle is the 25 to 34-year-olds, and you can see that owner occupation peaked in 1989 and then fell quite sharply, halved in fact. And surprisingly, the period when credit became a lot easier is a period when owner occupation for young people actually fell. Of course, that's because they were priced out of the market. Right, let me turn to solutions. I guess this is the part that you're most interested in. Let me turn to the planning issue. Paul Cheshire has written some wonderful pieces, a trenchant critique of the adverse economic consequences of the current planning system. Watling and Breach done some very good work on this as well. They call for a fundamental overhaul. They suggest replacing discretionary planning with flexible zoning, with a flexible zoning code as used in many other countries, where you have mixed use zones and approvals become greatly speeded up, provided buildings are consistent with the zone and with the building code. They also stress the importance of organized public consultation on local plans and make the point that current practice doesn't integrate infrastructure with housing, transport infrastructure, other infrastructure. And that's a key issue because it fuels resident fears about access to schools, hospitals, and other amenities. And that's a key source of NIMBYism, not in my backyard-ism. People worry that the infrastructure, the facilities won't be provided when new housing is built. Any reform should accommodate alternative cooperative models thriving in Europe. For example, in Denmark, cooperative housing is very popular, and community land trusts, which keep homes affordable by separating land and building ownership, are very important in other countries. And in England, interest is growing. There's a very nice paper by Nicholas Falk, who makes the point that merely dropping planning controls isn't enough. We have to have creative decision-making devolved to local authorities or local levels, authorities and regions, to spark well-connected neighborhoods, drawing on successful European examples to boost UK urban productivity and housing outcomes. In other words, learning from history, learning from other countries is really, really important. The second prong of the policy package concerns land value capture. That means capturing for the taxpayer, rather than private landowner, more of the land gains created by planning permissions and public investment. Today, landowners wield very strong bargaining power. You can see that in the high option prices for unpermissioned land and for what are called overage agreements that secure extra compensation once planning permission is granted. So in other words, a farmer sells land to a developer, and the agreement is that if in 10 years' time planning permission is given, the farmer is then compensated by the developer for the planning permission. Land value capture is very widespread around the world. There's a great OECD compendium that explains the many, many different ways in which land value capture is used around the world. And historically, land value capture helped to make housing affordable during the New Towns program. And once again, revenues from selling land with planned permission could be used to subsidize social housing. To make land value capture in the UK more effective requires reforming the 1961 Land Compensation Act beyond the recent amendments to compulsory purchase rules under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. The current narrow scope of that act limits regeneration, and in fact, no new compulsory purchase orders have actually been made. Authorities should be able to use compulsory purchase orders swiftly, allowing bodies such as Homes England to acquire land for development projects. One of the key problems is that retaining hope value as a compensation principle impedes needed changes. If one combined property tax reform with land value capture, that could have a big effect, and I'll make that point a bit later. Another issue are the fiscal rules that the Treasury uses. The Treasury has now changed the fiscal rule to public sector financial net worth. Now that means they have to use financial intermediaries to translate the value of public land ownership into financial terms. It'd be far better if publicly owned land at market rates could be set off against debt without having to use financial intermediaries. The third ingredient is social housing. We need to build a lot more social housing. The social housing stock now serves more elderly, low-income, disabled residents, often in weak labour market areas. And that decline has driven up housing benefit costs and forced many into substandard private rentals. Investing in social housing is essential to tackle the UK affordability crisis and has many broader economic gains. It creates construction jobs, boosts local demand, provides training for youth, cuts long-term welfare and health expenditure. And for key workers, providing social housing allows them to stay near their workplaces and helps the retention, for example, of nurses in the NHS. The National Housing Federation notes that over 3 million Britons live in poverty due to housing costs. Better quality homes raise educational outcomes, workforce participation, and energy efficiency. Indeed, the National Audit Office estimates that every £1 spent on social housing generates at least £2.7 in long-term economic benefits. With reforms in planning, land value capture, and property taxes, the cost-benefit ratio could be even higher. So let me turn to property taxes. One of the remarkable things about property taxes is that it challenges a long-held belief in economics that there's a conflict between reducing inequality and enhancing efficiency and growth. And that this is one area where actually you have synergy between reducing inequality and efficiency and growth. These are some of the benefits: broaden the tax base, shifting investment incentives, stabilize the macroeconomy and the regional economy, catalyze land value capture, allocate the existing housing stock more efficiently, and by reducing the associated transactions taxes, labour market flexibility increases, the economy becomes more adaptable to structural shifts. And there are benefits for social exclusion and inequality, including, of course, regional levelling up. Because if you tax more heavily the high value areas, the more prosperous high value areas, and lower taxes on the low value, less prosperous areas, that helps to reduce regional inequality. And finally, a green aspect to taxation could have major benefits for the environment. let me talk about property tax deferral. That's, I think, really important. The problem of the cash poor, property rich household is an absolutely key problem in any kind of redesign of property taxation or revaluation. In other countries, deferral schemes have been quite widespread, quite widespread away, but the take-up is remarkably low. And some of the reasons are that people worry about restrictive eligibility, the complexity, the rising debt. And because of that, I have proposed a simple interest-free, equity-based deferral. The idea here is that the unpaid tax is registered as a proportional interest to the land registry, and repayment is then made when the property is sold. So, for example, if there were a 0.5% rate for cash payers, 0.6% for deferrers, after 10 years of deferment, 6% of the sale value would be paid in the tax. And that compensates the tax authority for the delay in receiving the tax revenue. One advantage of that is that this equity-based design promotes economic stability by encouraging cash payments during house price booms, taking cash out of the economy. So the current tax regime in the UK, in terms of council tax, it looks like this. It's highly regressive. It's regressive within each local authority. It's regionally regressive. And you can see the aggressiveness in this picture as well. So this is a picture that combines the impact of council tax, which is the blue line, and the blue pyramid, and the orange one, which shows the impact of stamp duty. So the idea here is that stamp duty is a once-off payment. If you average over 15 years, you get kind of the average impact over time. So you can combine the two in one picture, which is what Lucy and Cook has done here. You can see that the regressiveness of the blue is offset by the progressiveness of the orange. So in other words, going up to higher tax bands, stamp duty is much, much higher, whereas council tax is much, much lower. The two offset each other to a degree. And therefore, that's part of the reason why they have to be reformed jointly. My proposal is to let me turn to my proposal. So what I would do would be to replace council tax in just the top two bands, with annual levy of 0.5% of property value for UK owners, 1% for non-UK owners or owners of second homes, and a small surcharge on the part of property valued above 3 million. And then green discounts and a simple deferral scheme for cash poor retirees who'd pay 0.6% of house value for every year deferred, as mentioned earlier. And simultaneously to cut the higher stamp duty rates to 5% to balance progressivity. And together, my calculations suggest it could raise as much as 9 billion compared to current tax revenue from those bands. Also, I think a land value tax on all unbuilt land on the part of value above £40,000 per hectare would incentivize land release and building. It would leave most farmers untouched. So the idea, the political feasibility of this is because it limits reform to a very small group of people. There are only 1.14 million households who are in bands, in the top 2 council tax bands. So it's because only those are affected. The rest of the population doesn't have to worry about the uncertainty and the possible negative or positive implications for them that are part of what drives resistance to change. So let me draw some conclusions. The institutional framework shapes land and housing markets, influencing growth, inequality, and the quality of life. Neoclassical economics has largely ignored land as a production factor, unlike the old classical economics. And I think this oversight in education has dulled awareness of land's economic role and the chronic flaws of the UK's post-Thatcher institutions. The current government has bravely pushed planning reform, pledged land value capture, indicated a big expansion in social housing investment, and enhanced rental security. And those are all a clear break from policies of the post-Thatcher period. That is quite brave. Whether property tax reform is going to follow, we might discover next week. The National Planning Framework that they introduced in December of 2024 introduced golden rules for green belt development and land value benchmarks. However, industry pushback, backsliding on reforms, and a London building shortfall have softened affordable housing commitments. The target of 1.5 million homes, this Parliament looks unrealistic without stronger land value capture. Because, of course, funding, the funding that's been allocated, is going to be insufficient, particularly in high demand, high value areas. Construction firms profit mainly from buying land and reselling it after development, in the UK, that is. Affordability requires a sustained drop in real land prices, and that suggests we need a shift from the speculative model used in most of the building industry, buying land in advance, selling land with houses on it later, and making a profit from the increase in the land price. We need to move to something more stable. That includes building homes for tenants, including single-family units, where the returns come from the stable flow of rents rather than from the quick sale of the home. Newton has argued, it's called for a partial public contracting model to meet housing targets, to counter the emphasis on the speculative building industry. A tax on unbuilt high-value land could spur faster development by penalising developers who delay building. Announcing a tax like that early would accelerate construction and help bodies like Homes England to acquire land for development. One final remark. Home ownership remains popular for multiple reasons. Tenure security, control over the fabric of the home, inheritance, and because of the historic price gains. For today's generation, real land prices should fall. And that challenges one of the traditional motives or benefits of home ownership, thought to be a benefit of home ownership. Paradoxically, improved affordability should lift ownership rates. You saw that picture earlier of the falling home ownership rates as people became priced out of the market. If you bring prices down, home ownership should organically rise. So the government should avoid short-term measures that inflate ownership figures and instead pursue lasting reforms that steer the market towards sustainable growth and genuine affordability. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. We've got a few minutes for questions, either people in the room or I believe online as well. So I'll take a couple of questions to get started. I've got somebody at the back there and somebody here. So over here, thanks.
I was wondering if you have any comments on the Help to Buy and shared ownership scheme at the moment.
Help to Buy or shared ownership, fantastic. And then a colleague here, just sorry, to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm a third-year mature undergraduate here at Bristol. Not in economics, though, I'm afraid. My question is... Oh, yeah, sure thing. Yes, thank you. Hi there. My question is, how does your supply and demand model account for productivity growth in cities? And by historic example, I'm considering the island of Manhattan, for example. As a city economy becomes more productive, it sucks in more workers who are incentivized to move there. Supply meets that demand, and the city becomes more productive, thus reinforcing demand. And you have this potentially intuitively divergent effects as prices increase and do not stabilize, despite supply being responsive.
Okay, John, just got Help to Buy.
Okay, Help to Buy.
Etc.
Yeah. My big worry about Help to Buy is that it boosts demand. Okay, so given that we have a supply and demand problem, boosting demand isn't necessarily a good thing because it raises prices. So without the corresponding increase in supply, Help to Buy might just help a few people in the process who are being helped immediately, but actually force up prices for everybody else and not contribute to a general improvement. The point about Manhattan is an interesting one. I think that part of the premise of your question was that the supply of accommodation in Manhattan improved during this process of agglomeration, of the benefits of agglomeration and productivity growth. If that doesn't happen, what tends to happen in the British regions is that, for example, London attracts lots of people. House prices in London rise, and you would have thought that should produce better regional balance because higher housing costs make it more difficult for people to move to London because construction is constrained there. But instead, what happens is that many people anticipate that London house prices carry on improving, and so the immigrants keep flooding in, and that prolongs the relative boom in London compared to the other regions. Historically, we've seen these waves in the UK where regions have had large appreciation and yet managed to attract an inflow, and then eventually prices peak, and then you get a sudden reversal. London lost quite a lot of population relative to other regions in the early 90s when London prices fell when there was a crisis in London. So regional balance is something that property taxes could help because they dampen these speculative booms in pricing.
Okay, I've got two at the front here, if you don't mind. Have we got any online, by the way?
We do have a couple.
As one, so I'll take two here and the next one online, okay? So to yourself and then yourself.
Abby, citizen of Bristol, formerly educated in international relations. But I have read recently, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, because it does link to points you have covered earlier. So Citra Living, which is a subsidiary of Lloyds Bank, has bought 10,000 houses and seeks to have 30,000 by the end of 2030. I think other banks are moving into this sector as part of the shared ownership, sort of similar almost to Help to Buy, not quite. And my instinct is this isn't going to serve the working person well, but that it will serve the banks because they are increasing assets, which will in turn to allow them to carry more leverage or debt in other areas. Could you see how this, or could you explain how you might see this playing out in the next 25 years?
Just pass that one along, yeah.
Thank you. Clive Stevens. I'm an ex-Bristol City Councillor and now a student. Earlier on, you alluded to a study that showed when house prices went up, productivity went down. Are you able to provide some cause and effect to explain that, please?
And then we'll take this.
Thank you.
Should we take it one by one? Just take it one by one while John's composing himself.
Hi. So this is from from Andrew, who's online. I'm slightly editing it. Sorry, Andrew. It's usually said that house prices set land prices, not vice versa. Developers are price takers, not makers. In the long run, high land prices may limit supply, though. Do you disagree with that?
Okay. Right. Maybe, yeah. Developers are are price takers rather than price makers. Well, yes. The market, a particular developer, will try to set the price at which he sells he sells the housing that he's produced based on the land that he's acquired previously and the cost of building. The market obviously has a big influence on the price that he was able to acquire the land for, and the timing is crucial for when he sells. Now, builders have some control over the price because they can slow the rate of building out in order to prevent local price falls from reducing their profits, and that is part of the British problem, that the building out rate, even once planning permission is given, is far lower than in other countries, compared to Germany, for example. So that they have some control over their pricing, but they have to take building costs and land prices as given at the time that they transact. On the Lloyds Bank question, I mean, in principle, I think increasing the supply of rentals is part of the long run solution for the UK, because we need to have a more diverse tenure structure. The rental accommodation that's available is very limited, and having small landlords who are not very good at being landlords is not very good for tenants. So having a professionalized long-term commitment by investors, and even better if house builders themselves were in the business of not only building the land but then collecting the rents for the next 30 years, that could be quite a stabilizing influence on their activity. It would make them less prone to speculative activity and more interested in the long term. What was the third question?
You're straying perilously close into something I might have a view on there, so let's not do that. So it was productivity and the relationship with house prices. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. This is very much. I mean, obviously, there's a relationship between productivity, earnings, and house prices. If in a region earnings go up, that because productivity rises, that tends to increase local house prices. That's fine. No problem with that. The problem is that in these booms, the nature of these speculative booms is that it diverts credit away from the sectors that are more productive, tradable sectors, for example, other services, to real estate. And that has a negative effect on total economy productivity. And there's, as I say, quite a bunch of studies that show these consequences.
Thanks, John. So this session is followed by a reception outside. I'm going to abuse my position and say I'll take one or two more questions if there are one or two more, and then we'll draw ourselves to close. So the gentleman here with the glasses and the gentleman in the middle with the jumper. If that's not too vague. The guy with the jumper. Yeah.
Also have a jumper.
That he was, but his is big.
Hi, I'm Adam Wright. I'm the head of public policy at the British Academy. My question is about we've seen something in the UK. I mean, it doesn't just happen in the UK, but we've seen a lot of gentrification in the UK in certain areas. It might be partly as a result of deindustrialisation, but I'm wondering how much of gentrification is a result of the kind of issues that you've looked at in terms of housing and house prices, and how much can we resolve some of the inequalities that are generated by gentrification using the reforms that you suggest?
Thank you. That's great. Last question.
Yeah, thanks for the very interesting talk. The question I have is about bringing the big developers to the table, and it seems like in your package, this tax on like land valued at over 40,000 per hectare is the big thing to try and bring them to the table. I kind of wonder if there's more that you think we should do, if that will bring them to the table, if that will get them to meet demand.
Just on that last, a tax on high-value unbuilt land, which could include agricultural land where hope value, for example, is an important ingredient of the value of land near Bristol, let's say, or near Oxford. Taxing land of that kind beyond a certain value level, I think would have quite significant benefits. For example, it would incentivize a farmer who sitting on valuable development land to offer that land to an auction where Homes England is buying up land in order to assemble a large land for a large development. So by taxing the land, the farmer has a much bigger incentive to sell the land, and that has a beneficial effect on land prices. And more generally, land value taxes should reduce the prices of land, and of course land is, as I've argued, a key ingredient in the affordability crisis. Gentrification. Gentrification in Bristol, for example, I guess in London, many areas that were previously low value with poor housing have become gentrified as more affluent people have moved in and raised those prices and invested in the local housing. The tax system, the council tax system, is quite defective because it doesn't tax high value properties properly, and the combination of not taxing high value property and the very high rates of stamp duty is one of the factors that leads wealthy wealthy owners, for example, in London, to build down, to invest in expensive basements rather than to move house and make their housing available for other people. So I think the process of gentrification could be dampened quite a lot if we had a more sensible tax system that both reduced the cost of transactions and increased the taxes that high value locations pay. Gentrification is in some ways an organic process. I mean, people will move to more beneficial locations with better transport links, possibly with cheaper housing. So it's important that the infrastructure is aligned with, infrastructure development is aligned with what's happening in the housing market in order to keep affordability and keep the access to good locations open to a wide range of people.
Thanks, John. I think you'd also connect it to some of the decommodification, the community land trust, the co-op, some of these things which maybe stabilise neighbourhoods in that way as well.
True.
Okay, thanks ever so much for everybody for their questions. I'm sorry if there are other questions that people would like to raise, but I think probably draw our formal session to a close.
Can I just say one last thing?
Yeah, of course.
Because you were pressing me on the timing, I didn't talk about the green aspect of the whole story. And I think that the climate crisis really is a very, very severe problem. The tipping points that the climate is facing are frightening. And because housing and buildings in general contribute so much to global heating in terms of exuding greenhouse gases, it's really important that the tax system, in the absence of a carbon tax, recognizes that, and that we design property taxes that take account of that. And having a green discount, I mean, taxing buildings as well as land, but having a green discount for green buildings, I think is really important to move us in the right direction. It also helps to resolve the problem, the inequality problem, because many green regulations actually are very unequalizing. They hurt poor people, often hurt poor people, at least in the short run, the most. And by having equalizing property taxes combined with green discounts, you resolve that tension between going green and meeting public resistance.
Absolutely. And don't forget, as John said, there's a copy of the paper that goes with the talk available on the website, and it talks through some of those issues in more detail as well. So thanks everybody for the questions. And just finish off before we go to the reception, but thanking once again John for an excellent and stimulating presentation.